A lot has happened in 2017, from terror attacks to natural disasters and personal loss, to new beginnings, weddings, births, new jobs and experiences. The end of the year is almost upon us, and as it approaches, we have to ask ourselves, are we ready for Christmas? Do we even want to celebrate Christmas this year? And can Christmas be, life-changing at all? For some of us, this might be the high point of the year, a time of celebration and joy of family and friends. But for others, it might be the lowest and the most depressing time of year. For all of us, we need to remember that Christmas is a celebration. Christmas celebrates light coming into the world to bring hope. And as a Christian, I celebrate Jesus' birth on December 25th, remembering why he came into the world. This message that Jesus came into the world is not only cathartic, it is also life-changing. And so I want to explore with you what a changed life looks like this Christmas season. How does Christmas change the way that we live? To do that, let's study the Bible and look at the book of Philippians and how it teaches us to shine like lights in the world. As we get started, it'll be helpful to know a bit of the background of the book of Philippians. What type of book is this and who wrote it and why? The book of Philippians is a letter that a guy named Paul wrote to a bunch of his friends over in a city called Philippi. Paul was an early missionary, a man who traveled around the world to tell people about Jesus. Paul traveled around the known world and set up churches in the different cities, including Philippi. And we can read about this in the book of Acts. If you have a minute, pause the video here and go read Acts chapter 16, verses 9 to 40. This will give you an idea of who Paul is writing to, and the rest of the video will make a lot more sense if you do. So go ahead and pause the video and read Acts chapter 16, verses 9 to 40. So who were the Philippians? From looking at this chapter in Acts, we see that Philippi was a leading Roman city in Macedonia. And we know from this and the history of the city that the people there were really keen on being Roman citizens. They would have spoken Latin and had a lot of connections back to Rome. It would have been a bit like Chicago at the end of the 19th century, as they wanted to be the representative for the United States to the rest of the world. Philippi was a center of culture and industry, and we see this in the variety of people that the Apostle Paul meets in his time there. There are three different types of people described here in Acts 16. First, there was a woman named Lydia, a first-century fashion entrepreneur. She was a seeker, someone interested in spiritual matters. Lydia was the first to hear about Jesus and to believe in him. And as we read in this chapter, after she believed, she provided for Paul and his companions, hosting them in her house until they left the town. In many ways, she represents the upper middle class, people with an education and with opportunities. In contrast, Paul next meets a slave girl. This is, a very different interaction. Instead of being able to do whatever she wants, this slave girl had to make money for her masters. So how she was able to spend time following Paul about and yelling things at him is a bit of a mystery to me. But she does, and she proclaims the truth about him. She said, "These men are bondservants of the Most High God, who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation." Now the text doesn't say what happens to this slave girl after Paul casts the demon out of her. But this episode shows us that Paul and his companions weren't just talking to the rich. They weren't just talking to those with means. They were speaking with all sorts of people, people in poverty and slavery, people who were dissatisfied with their lives and were looking for something more. This leads to Paul and Silas being thrown in prison, and we get to meet the third type of person in Philippi, the prison guard. This guy was most likely a retired Roman soldier, and he would have been an old hat at all the Roman rules and standards. He knew the rules and followed them, even to the point of almost killing himself. The jailer responded to the gospel message, though. He saw how fragile his life was and how his job couldn't save him. There's a lot to learn and study from this passage, but let's just think about what type of culture was in Philippi. What was their culture like? There were merchants and slaves and soldiers. They have a highly cultured city with a lot to live up to, but there was also a lot of problems. And from the story in Acts, we see that plenty of the people were just happy to go about their lives, living out, making money, doing different things. But this was tested when the gospel was proclaimed. How does God's intervention in the world affect the way that people live? Some heard about Jesus, and it gave them hope and meaning. but others didn't like this message and fought against it. As we look at the book of Philippians this Christmas, I want to start by asking just a few questions. What is my culture like? How is it telling me how I should be living? And how does that differ from what Jesus says and what the Gospels teach about our lives? How do I respond to these different messages? This video will be a little bit longer than the rest of this series, and tomorrow we'll actually be getting into the book of Philippians. If you want to study further in Acts and look at this chapter and what Paul is doing and how God is working, I've created a little worksheet, and I'll leave a link down below in the video description. Thanks, and have a good one.